Have you ever staked everything? Not just your savings, not just your time, but your name, your dignity, the way people look at you when you walk into a room, on an idea that everyone around you was certain would fail. Have you ever stood in the middle of a field that everyone else called worthless and thought, quietly, stubbornly, I see something here that you don't? Let me tell you about Rosalind Maher. She was 29 years old when she inherited 43 acres of boreal fringe land in northern Ontario, about 2 hours northeast of Sudbury. The property had belonged to her great-uncle Clement, a quiet man who'd spent 40 years trying to coax something useful out of soil that didn't much want to cooperate. He grew a little hay when the drainage permitted. He kept a few chickens. He died in February, owing more to the credit union in Chelmsford than the land was probably worth. And he left it all to Rosalind because, as he'd written in his will with characteristic bluntness, she was the only one in the family who'd ever visited him more than once. She drove up from Barrie with everything she owned, packed into a second-hand pickup truck, and a plan that had formed somewhere between grief and stubbornness. She was going to make it work. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she was going to make it work. The neighbors thought she was sweet, the kind of sweet you say when you mean foolish. The property sat at the edge of a wide, shallow basin, maybe 8 acres of low ground that collected snowmelt and spring rain, and held it there sulking for most of the growing season. Clay subsoil, poor drainage, the kind of ground that sucked the boots right off your feet in May and cracked like old porcelain by August. The previous owners, going back generations, had tried to drain it, tile it, heap gravel into it, fence it off. Nothing stuck. Mr. Dufour at the farm supply store in Hanmer looked at Rosalind's hand-drawn sketch of the property and made a sound low in his throat, not unkind, just the sound of a man who'd seen this particular problem before and knew how it usually ended. That low section, he said, tapping the paper with one finger, you're not going to grow anything in there. You know that, right? I'm thinking about flooding it, Rosalind said. Mr. Dufour looked up from the sketch. On purpose, she added. He handed her back the paper. You want fertilizer for the upper field, I've got what you need. She bought the fertilizer. She also drove 3 hours south to a freshwater aquaculture operation outside of Huntsville and spent an afternoon asking questions that the owner, a patient man named Mr. Beckford, answered with the careful generosity of someone who recognized genuine curiosity when he saw it. What Rosalind had read in academic papers, in aquaculture forums, in the margins of a library book she'd checked out twice, was that crayfish, specifically signal crayfish and native Ontario species, could be farmed in exactly the kind of shallow, clay-bottomed, seasonally flooded habitat that her low ground already was. They burrowed, they tolerated cold, they fed on decomposing vegetation and algae, and the kind of aquatic plant life that established itself naturally in standing water. And the market, the live restaurant market, the specialty seafood distributors who supplied high-end kitchens in Toronto and Ottawa, was underserved in a way that still surprised her every time she looked at the numbers. Nobody was doing it at scale in this part of the province. Not because it was impossible, because nobody had looked at a waterlogged, clay-heavy, problem-riddled low field and thought opportunity instead of liability. She called her plan a freshwater crayfish operation. She said it carefully, professionally, the way you say things when you want people to take them seriously. The people of Levine Township called it, "That thing Clement's niece is doing with the bugs." She told her mother on a Sunday phone call in April, when the snow was still melting in shaded places and the low ground had already begun to fill. Her mother was quiet for a moment. "Crayfish," she said finally, in the tone of someone confirming a dental diagnosis. "The market is real, Mum. I've done the research. "I'm sure you have, sweetheart." Her cousin Derek, who farmed cash crops outside of Elora and had opinions about everything, drove up in June to have a look. He stood at the edge of the low ground, which by then had maybe 3 feet of water in the deepest section, and watched the surface for a while. "You know," he said, "you could probably sell this section, even with the drainage issues. Someone might want it for a hunt camp. I'm not selling it. Or you could just leave it, write it off, focus on the upper 40. Derek, I'm just saying there are easier ways too. I know there are easier ways." She looked at the water. It was cloudy with sediment, but it caught the afternoon light in a way that made it look almost deliberate, almost designed. "I don't want the easier way. I want this way." He drove back to Elora that evening. He didn't say she was crazy. He didn't have to. Now, let me tell you something about the 6 months that followed, because this is the part that tends to get left out of stories like this. The part between the idea and the outcome. The part that isn't inspiring, isn't triumphant, and doesn't make for a clean narrative. It was just hard, relentlessly, exhaustingly, sometimes humiliatingly hard. Rosalind had budgeted carefully for her first seeding of juvenile crayfish. She'd sourced them from a licensed supplier in Quebec, a small operation run by an older man named Mr. Labrec, who'd been farming signal crayfish for 15 years, and who, to his credit, did not try to talk her out of her plan. He asked good questions. He shipped carefully. The first batch arrived alive and in good condition, packed in insulated boxes with enough oxygenated water to last the trip. She introduced them to the flooded low ground on a cool morning in late May, kneeling at the edge in rubber waders while the sky threatened rain. She released them in batches, watching them disappear into the murk, and tried not to feel like she was making a terrible mistake. The money for the seeding had come from 3 sources she'd rather not have had to use. A small business loan from the credit union in Chelmsford, the same one that held Clement's old debt, which gave the transaction a particular flavor of irony. A personal loan from her father, who'd given it without enthusiasm, but without complaint, and the sale of a piece of jewelry she'd inherited from her grandmother. She doesn't talk about that last one much. Some costs aren't just financial. She was working the upper field herself that summer, growing mixed hay on contract, to a livestock operation near Isilda. The work kept her busy during the day, kept money moving, kept the loan payments manageable. At night, she read. She corresponded by email with Mr. Beckford in Huntsville and with a researcher at the University of Guelph who'd written her thesis on freshwater invertebrate aquaculture and who responded to Rosalind's long, specific questions with responses that were equally long and specific. That kind of generosity matters. It accumulates. She also drove past the low ground every morning on her way to the upper field and tried to read the surface of the water for signs of life. Crayfish aren't visible the way fish are. They burrow. They're nocturnal. For weeks, she had no particular evidence that anything was alive down there at all.
"How's the experiment going?"
Mr. Dufour asked her one afternoon at the farm supply store, and she noted the word he chose.
"Experiment. Not operation. Not farm. Experiment."
"It's going," she said. The first sign came in July. She was walking the perimeter of the flooded section at dusk, which had become a habit, when she noticed the mud at the shallow eastern edge was marked with burrow openings. Dozens of them, small round holes like miniature well shafts, punched into the clay right at the water line. She crouched down. She put her hand in the water very slowly and felt around near one of the burrows. Something pinched her finger, hard enough to sting. She laughed out loud, alone at the edge of her flooded field in the gray Ontario dusk, and the sound surprised her. It had been a while since she'd laughed like that, sudden and unguarded and real. They were there. They had survived the winter seeding established territories, started burrowing. The habitat had worked. She took photographs. She sent them to Mr. Beckford and to the researcher at Guelph. She called her father and described the burrow holes in detail that probably exceeded his interest in crayfish biology, but he listened anyway, and at the end he said, "That's my girl," in the quiet way he had, and she had to hold the phone very still for a moment before she could answer. She didn't tell many people what she'd found. Not yet. There's a particular vulnerability in early success. It's still fragile, still dependent on a dozen variables you can't fully control, and the moment you announce it, it becomes subject to other people's expectations and doubts and advice. She'd had enough of other people's advice. But word got around anyway. It always does in small communities. By August, she'd had 3 separate conversations with neighbors who'd heard she was raising bugs in the swamp and wanted to understand what exactly that meant. She answered patiently. She explained the market. She explained the biology. She showed Mr. Arsenault from the next property her notes on crayfish density estimates, and he looked at them the way people look at things they don't want to understand. "So you're actually going to sell them," he said, "to restaurants. That's the plan." He was quiet for a moment. How much do restaurants pay for crayfish? When she told him, he recalibrated. She could see it happening. The slight shift in his expression. The moment where that thing Clement's niece is doing with the bugs began to sound, against his will, like something else. "Huh," he said. She's learned to appreciate "huh." It's the sound of a mind opening a door it didn't know was there. The first real harvest came in September of the 2nd year. I want to be precise about this. It was not immediate, it was not dramatic, and it did not solve everything at once. The crayfish had overwintered well, better than she dared hope, and the population had expanded into the southern section of the flooded area. She'd added a small amount of aquatic vegetation management the previous spring, working with rather than against the natural plant succession, and the habitat had rewarded her for it. She harvested using wire traps, the same basic design commercial crayfish operators use across North America, baited and checked at first light. She did it alone, mostly. Waders, a headlamp in the pre-dawn dark, the sound of water moving around her knees and frogs calling from the cattail fringe, and the strange, almost meditative quality of work that is physical and purposeful and entirely your own. The first delivery went to a restaurant group in Sudbury. A chef named Mr. Heikkinen, who'd been buying live crayfish from a Quebec supplier at considerable shipping cost, and who, when Rosalind had called him 6 months earlier to introduce herself and her operation, had said, "Call me when you have volume," in the flat, busy tone of someone who expects never to hear from you again. She called him when she had volume. He tasted them. He called her back the same afternoon. "These are good," he said. "These are actually very good." By October, she had 3 restaurant accounts in Sudbury, 1 in North Bay, and an inquiry from a specialty food distributor in Toronto who'd heard about her through a chef's industry group and wanted to know if she could supply volume year-round. The answer at that point was not quite, but it was getting there. Now here is where I have to slow down, because what happened next is the part of this story that nobody talks about when they're feeling inspired, and it's the part that matters most. Her name started circulating, not widely, not in any way that would seem significant from the outside, but in the particular small circuit way that a story travels when it's surprising enough to repeat. A young woman up near Laveen, farming crayfish in a flooded field, everybody said was useless. People drove past her property on the county road and slowed down to look at the low ground, which was nothing much to look at from a distance. Just water, just reeds, just the unremarkable surface of a productive habitat going about its business invisibly. Some of those people were curious. Some of them were impressed. And some of them, Rosalind would learn, had done a little math. Mr. Price arrived in late October. She didn't know him. He was from Sudbury, had been introduced to her work through one of her restaurant contacts, presented himself as an investor interested in agri-food development opportunities in underserved rural markets. He had a card. He had a firm handshake. He had the specific confidence of a man who was accustomed to being taken seriously. He stood at the edge of the low ground with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the water. 43 acres total, he said. And you're monetizing how much of it? About 8 acres currently. I'm planning to expand into an adjacent section in the spring. What would it take to scale this to something significant? Say, 20 acres of active habitat. Rosalind explained what it would take. She'd already run those numbers. She knew them precisely. Mr. Price nodded through her explanation in the particular way that means I'm already past this part in my head. Then he made her an offer. Not for a partnership, not for an investment in her operation, for the land. He wanted to buy the 43 acres, develop the Crayfish operation at scale with professional management, and offer her a consulting contract for the first 2 years of operation. The offer was, she had to admit, not an unreasonable number. For farmland in this part of northern Ontario, with a drainage problem and a clay subsoil, it was actually more than she might have expected a year ago. She stood there at the edge of her field and felt something she hadn't anticipated. Not anger, not flattery, but a very particular and clarifying kind of cold, because she understood exactly what she was looking at. The same ground that nobody had wanted, that her neighbors had watched her flood with something between pity and amusement, that the bank had lent against reluctantly, that her mother had heard about with a tone of careful concern. That ground was now attractive. Her work had made it attractive. Her stubbornness and her research and her knowledge and her 2 years of pre-dawn mornings in rubber waders had made it attractive. And what Mr. Price was offering her, politely and professionally and with a firm handshake, was the chance to be separated from it. I appreciate you coming out, she said. The land isn't for sale. He smiled. He had, she noticed, a very practiced smile. Everything has a number. Mine doesn't, she said. Drive safe, she called her father that evening. She told him about the offer, about Mr. Price, about what she'd said at the end. Her father was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good." Just that, good. She sat on the porch of Clement's old house, her house now, and watched the last of the light go off the top of the spruce trees at the edge of the property, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for a long time. It wasn't triumph exactly. It was something quieter and more durable than triumph. It was the feeling of knowing exactly where you stand. I want to tell you where things are now, because the story doesn't end with a door being closed in someone's face. Or rather, it doesn't end there in the way that feels finished. Rosalind Maher is 32 years old. She has expanded the active crayfish habitat to 14 acres of her low ground, with plans to develop 2 more in the coming year. She has 6 restaurant accounts across northeastern Ontario and a distribution arrangement with a specialty supplier in Toronto who sends her crayfish to kitchens she'll probably never visit. She hired her first part-time employee last spring, a young man named Mr. Gallant from Hanmer who drives out 3 mornings a week and who, she reports, has become a genuine convert to the particular satisfaction of pre-dawn trap checks. She's also added a small component to her operation that she didn't anticipate: educational tours for school groups and agricultural students, which she started almost by accident after a high school agriculture class from Sudbury asked if they could come see the operation. She charges a small fee. She talks about crayfish biology and freshwater habitat management and the economics of alternative aquaculture. She talks about reading the land instead of fighting it. The students, she says, ask better questions than most adults. Mr. Arsenault, her neighbor, stopped his truck at her gate last summer. He'd heard she was expanding. "You're actually doing it," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I told you I was going to." He was quiet for a beat. "You want to know something? My low section, the one along the back fence? I always said it was useless. Never could drain it right." He paused. "You think it might be worth looking at again?" Rosalind looked at him for a moment. She thought about the conversation they'd had 3 years earlier, when he'd looked at her notes with the polite incomprehension of someone examining a document in a foreign language. "Come by on Saturday," she said. "I'll show you what I look for." He came by on Saturday. Here is what I want to leave you with, not a lesson, because Rosalind would be the first to tell you she's still learning, and the land is still teaching her things she didn't expect. But an observation, what everyone around her called a problem was, in fact, just a reality they hadn't found the right question for yet. The low ground wasn't broken. It wasn't cursed. It wasn't proof of her great-uncle's failure, or the limits of the land or the futility of trying. It was 43 acres waiting for someone who would look at it without flinching and ask the right question. She was 29 years old when she asked it. She was standing in rubber waders in a flooded clay field in northern Ontario, and everyone who knew her thought she was sweet, the kind of sweet you say when you mean foolish. She knew what she was doing. She just hadn't proved it yet. That's the part they never tell you about, the gap between knowing and proving, the months and years of unglamorous, uncertain, unwitnessed work that happen between the idea and the outcome. That's the part that requires something that has no impressive name, just the willingness to keep going when the evidence is thin and the water is cold, and the people who care about you are asking gentle questions that mean, "Are you sure?" She was sure. She just kept it to herself until the numbers agreed with her. And when they did, she didn't say, "I told you so." She said, "Come by on Saturday. I'll show you what I look for."